In the forgotten archives of Hong Kong, far from cameras and official records, there is a folder that should never have come to light. It contains no photos, no film contracts, no scripts. Inside, there is only a manuscript, old, incomplete, handwritten, describing a fighting style that, according to the author, could never be defeated. For decades, scholars ignored this document. Some said it was a fraud. Others said it was too dangerous to be taken seriously. What almost no one knows is that this manuscript would have passed through the hands of Bruce Lee, and what he did with it has never been told publicly. Behind the scenes of his meteoric rise between filming, exhausting training, and meetings with producers, there are fragmented accounts, notes in personal notebooks, testimonies from close students, torn-out pages that have disappeared, that suggest that Bruce Lee became obsessed with this impossible style. A combat system described as perfect, but which no human being has ever managed to fully execute. The question that arises is disturbing. What if he had tried? What if in the last months of his life, Bruce wasn't just training for films or perfecting his Jeet Kune Do, but trying to make something the manuscript itself said was unattainable a reality? There is evidence of secret training sessions, injuries that have never been officially explained, sudden changes in his philosophy, and even reports of voluntary isolation. None of this was included in popular biographies. This is not the Bruce Lee you know. This is the story of the man who decided to face an impossible ideal and paid a price that few realized. The question is, how far can someone go to prove that perfection exists? For decades, any mention of a lost manuscript linked to Bruce Lee was treated as myth, exaggeration, or behind-the-scenes invention. But the silence surrounding this story didn't come about by chance. It was constructed, reinforced, and, at times, carefully protected by people who had a lot to lose. In the early 1970s, Bruce Lee wasn't just an actor on the rise. It was a cultural asset of high value, a symbol that connected Eastern and Western markets, generating millionaire investments and gigantic expectations. His image needed to be accurate, disciplined, confident, invincible. There was no room for dangerous obsessions, nor for a search for a fighting style that, according to the manuscript itself, could lead a practitioner to physical and mental collapse. The first signs appeared discreetly. Notes in his notebooks began to change tone. Training began to take place at unusual times. Nearby students reported sessions where Bruce attempted to execute sequences that seemed to go against his own principles of efficiency and simplicity. There were extreme movements, unlikely combinations, physical demands that surpassed even the standards he had already imposed on himself. Some say he had found something that challenged the very basis of Jeet Kune Do, a structure that promised absolute perfection, but demanded sacrifices incompatible with the human body. People around noticed. Producers were worried about delays and injuries. Training partners began to move away. There were rumors that Bruce was trying to overcome a threshold that no one had ever crossed, and that this threshold was not just technical, but psychological. It was at that moment that the control began. Documents disappeared, trainings were interrupted, testimonies were discredited. Anything that might suggest that Bruce Lee was involved with something outside the official script was slowly erased or reinterpreted. The objective was simple: protect the legacy, preserve the symbol, keep intact the narrative of the master who had achieved the perfect form of martial expression. But there is a flaw in this silence. Among the fragmented reports, mention of a presence appears repeatedly. Someone who was not part of his students, nor the production circle, nor traditional schools. A figure who only appeared at specific times, who trained with Bruce in closed sessions, and who would have been the key to deciphering parts of the manuscript. This name never appeared in official records. No photographs, no records, just vague descriptions. Someone who fought without style, without pattern, as if he was executing exactly what the manuscript described. And it is precisely this presence that transforms the story into something even more unsettling. Because if the perfect style had never been practiced, how could anyone demonstrate it? The question that has been buried for decades is simple and disturbing. Who was this rival? Before any attempt to reveal who that mysterious rival was, it is necessary to understand the object that gave rise to everything, the manuscript. Without him, none of this story would make sense. And perhaps that is exactly why, for so many years, no one managed to get close to its true content. The few who claimed to have seen the document described something strange. It was neither a traditional martial arts manual nor an ordinary philosophical treatise. It was a mixture of the two, written in fragments, with contradictory passages, incomplete instructions, and observations that seemed to defy the laws of the human body. Some pages contained movement diagrams that did not follow any known style. Others brought notes about rhythm, time, and intention that suggested a combat without form, without pattern, without anticipation. The central idea was disturbing. Perfection would not come from technique, but from the total elimination of predictability. A fighter who became completely unreadable, physically and mentally, would, in theory, be unbeatable. But there was an implicit cost. Among the notes were veiled warnings about nervous exhaustion, loss of identity, and collapse of control. The manuscript suggested that to achieve this state, the practitioner would need to dismantle their own structure of thought, abandoning conditioned reflexes and even self-preservation instincts. It was a path that few would even dare to try. When the link between this document and Bruce Lee began to be whispered among restricted circles, theories immediately emerged and multiplied. Some believed the manuscript was an ancient relic, possibly originating from monks who sought a state of extreme meditative combat, something beyond any traditional school. Others argued that it was a modern experiment, perhaps created by someone who studied psychology, biomechanics, and combat at the same time, trying to build the absolute fighter in scientific terms. There were also the darker theories. One claimed that the manuscript was not a guide, but a test, a filter, something created to attract only those who were willing to sacrifice everything for the idea of perfection. According to this view, the document would have circulated secretly for decades, passing through different masters, and always leaving behind stories of physical or mental collapse. And then there is the theory that few dare discuss openly, that the manuscript did not describe a style to be learned, but something that had already been achieved by someone. This hypothesis completely changes the meaning of the presence of that unknown rival. If the manuscript was just a record of something that already existed, then this man who trained with Bruce Lee was not a scholar. He was living proof that the impossible could be accomplished. This would explain why reports about him were so inconsistent. Some described him as extremely calm, almost apathetic. Others said he moved erratically, impossible to anticipate. There were those who said that fighting him was like fighting someone who didn't react. It just happened. None of this has been officially documented. No records were preserved. But curiously, the more people tried to deny the existence of the manuscript, the more small traces appeared: deleted comments, excerpts from edited interviews, pages torn from personal notebooks. It was as if someone was constantly cleaning up the trail, but always leaving a small flaw behind. And it is precisely in this failure that the biggest doubt of all arises. Because if so many theories have been created to explain the manuscript, and so many attempts have been made to hide its influence, then there exists a possibility that few are prepared to consider. What if the truth is neither of these theories, but something much closer, more human, and much more dangerous? Before revealing who the rival was, there is one last question that needs to be addressed. What if Bruce Lee wasn't trying to learn the perfect style, but rather to prove that no one should use it? Very few people came close to understanding what was actually written in that manuscript, not because he was impossible to read, but because when someone finally understood his instructions, the most common reaction wasn't admiration, it was recoil. The document did not teach a style. He dismantled them all. The text began with a simple, almost innocent principle. Everything that can be anticipated can be defeated. From then on, each page seemed to lead the reader into a process of deconstruction. First, he eliminated fixed forms. Then, the attack patterns. Next, the very notion of defense. The ultimate goal was to reach a state in which the fighter had no visible intention, no predictable rhythm, and no defined self during combat. It was more than technique. It was the dissolution of identity in motion. The diagrams, when analyzed together, formed sequences that broke known biomechanical limits. Abrupt changes in direction without apparent muscle preparation, blows that came from neutral points without telegraphy, steps that required extreme neuromuscular coordination, to the point of requiring the practitioner to have almost impossible control over reflexes and impulses. And then came the marginal notes. Short observations handwritten by different authors over time, as if several people had tried to follow that path and left warnings for those who came later. Loss of reference after the third cycle. The body responds, but the mind begins to fragment. Do not continue without supervision. It's not a method, it's a limit. When Bruce Lee had access to this material, something in him immediately recognized the value and the danger. That spoke directly to the principles he had already been developing in Jeet Kune Do, the idea of freedom, adaptation, rejection of rigid forms. But the manuscript took this concept to an extreme that even he had not considered acceptable. According to notes attributed to him, Bruce would have described the document as a bottomless mirror, something that reflected the essence of the fight, but that could also swallow anyone who looked too long. This explains why he never presented the manuscript publicly. While in his interviews and demonstrations Bruce advocated personal expression and efficiency, behind the scenes he was confronting a radical version of that same ideal, a version that required the complete nullification of the operational ego during combat. And he knew the risk it represented. There are reports that he even tested specific parts of the system, adapting elements he considered safe and discarding others. But there are also records of moments when he would have gone too far. Training sessions in which his performance became almost unrecognizable, followed by periods of profound exhaustion and silence. It was at this point that the decision changed. Bruce didn't want to destroy the manuscript. He also didn't want it to spread. He decided to keep it, not as a trophy, not as a weapon, but as a warning. Those closest to him noticed a subtle shift in his speech in recent months. He began to speak more frequently about boundaries, about the importance of maintaining identity within martial expression, about the danger of following any system to the point where it ceases to serve the practitioner. It was as if he was trying to protect something or someone. And this is where the story takes on a new layer. Because if Bruce Lee understood the true content of the manuscript, if he recognized its destructive potential and decided to keep it hidden, then his relationship with that mysterious rival was not just one of learning or challenge, it was surveillance. And this leads to one last question, which completely changes the meaning of everything that happened. If the manuscript described a state that no one should reach, why did this man seem to have already gotten there? For years, the entire narrative revolved around a mystery. The manuscript, the rival, the impossible style. But the truth that begins to emerge from the fragments left behind does not point to a mystical secret, but to a deeply human decision. The twist is not in the content of the manuscript. It's in the way Bruce Lee chose to deal with him. What few realized is that, as Bruce advanced in understanding that system, his stance was not one of blind fascination. It was one of critical confrontation. He did not see the manuscript as the definitive evolution of martial arts. He saw it as a dangerous limit, a kind of extreme experiment that revealed how far a human being could go before losing himself. And that changes everything, because that mysterious rival, who seemed to represent the perfect execution of the manuscript, stops being an enemy to be defeated and becomes a living warning of what happens when someone takes the idea of perfection too far. Bruce's fight, then, was not against a man, it was against an idea. The idea that there is a perfect way to act, to fight, to exist. In the final accounts attributed to him, there is a clear change in tone. Bruce begins to emphasize that true mastery is not in eliminating identity, but in refining it. It's not about becoming unpredictable at any cost, but about being authentic enough that no external form can imprison you. The manuscript showed what happened when someone sought absolute perfection. Bruce Lee showed what it means to seek true expression. This difference, although subtle, is what separates evolution from self-destruction. And this is where the story stops being just about martial arts and starts talking directly about everyday life. How many times do you try to be perfect to the point of disconnecting from who you really are? How often do you chase an impossible standard, at work, in relationships and decisions, believing that once you achieve it, you will finally have complete control? The manuscript represents this unattainable ideal. Bruce Lee represents the choice not to lose yourself in it. The biggest lesson in this story is not in secret techniques nor in forbidden styles. It's in the courage to recognize a limit and decide not to cross it, even when that means giving up something that seems extraordinary. And maybe that's why this story was hidden for so long. Because it doesn't glorify perfection. She exposes her price. If you want to continue exploring stories like this, those that go beyond the surface, reveal hidden scenes, and bring reflections that can change your way of thinking, then this is the time to act. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because some stories don't appear in official records, they appear to those who are willing to look deeper.